Welcome back. While in the previous video we were able to verify that our plugin is actually working within Adobe XD, it of course only printed a rather lame hello world to the console, which of course is not really what we want from our plugin. In this video we're actually going to take a look at how we can manipulate the scene graph itself. And what we will do within this video is we will just create a red rectangle, which will actually be the fundamental part basically of our plugin, because if you remember, our plugin in the end should create a checkerboard pattern, which of course consists of rectangles. And so if we're already able to create a rectangle, we are already a huge step further in our progress. And the first thing that is important here is that into all these command functions that we specify here, we actually get parsed into it some arguments. And the only really important bit for ourselves now is that the first argument we get passed into it is the so-called selection. And the selection is just a representation of all the different scene nodes that a user has selected within an Adobe XD document. Next up, we actually want to manipulate the scene graph itself. And to do that, let's quickly open the Adobe I/O based documentation for building plugins and take a look at the scene graph documentation, and especially the rectangle documentation, to see a little bit of how it works and how you can actually take a look at the documentation to figure things like this out yourself, because maybe it is not just creating rectangles that you want. So it's really important that you familiarize yourself with the documentation and are able to read through the documentation and learn these things for yourself. Alright, we are now within adobe.io/xd/uxp/develop/reference/rectangle, but really Adobe I/O UXP develop is all you have to remember, and from there you can just navigate through the menu to reference and then rectangle. And here we can actually find the documentation of how to basically create a rectangle. And you can even see some example code right here. So you can see that we can use let rect equals new rectangle to basically create a new rectangle. And then we can, for example, say the rectangle width should be 100 and so on. And it is actually quite similar to this, what we will build within our plugin. But what's even more important is that you can see that this rectangle then extends a class called graphic node, and the graphic node in turn has some properties like, for example, a fill color, which we will use, which can be a color. And I will actually open this color reference as well, because we will use the ability to create a new color. And all of this, as explained also in our theory part about the scene graph, extends the scene node class. So basically everything is a scene node, and you can see that a scene node actually has quite a lot of properties that you can then use to work with the scene graph. And this is really where it is up to you what you want to do with your plugin. In our case, all we want to do for now is to use a rectangle, so I will navigate back to our rectangle documentation and open it in a new tab. But for example, if you wanted to see what the specific options of, say, a line node, so a line object layer within Adobe XD would be, you could just open the line documentation, and you can see that apart from everything which the graphic node contains, which is all of this, including everything that the scene node contains, which is all of this, a line, for example, would contain a start, which is a point. You can once again take a look at what a point actually is. A point is just an object containing an x coordinate and a y coordinate, which are both numbers. It contains an endpoint, and it contains a method that you can use to actually set the start and end points. And like this, you can just navigate through this yourself and determine what it is you actually need for your plugins. But for now, we just want to create a new rectangle. So within our code, we will actually just use what we've just already seen within the documentation. We can just create a new rectangle, right? So we say we have a constant called rect, and we just say it's a new rectangle. This still isn't part of our document, it's just like an abstract representation, so to speak, of this rectangle. But before we can actually insert it into our document, we first of all have to specify a few more things. So, for example, we now have to specify that the rectangle has a width and a height of 100 pixels. So we just say, it's rather self-explanatory really, the rectangle width is 100. So we set the property width of the rectangle to 100. And if we now go back to our documentation, we can see that the rectangle just has this width property. It has to be higher than 0. 100 is higher than 0. So everything should be all right here. Next up, let's actually disable the stroke of this rectangle, because XD by default enables the stroke, so the border, so to speak, of graphic nodes, and I don't really like how that looks, and instead we just want to fill our rectangle with a solid red color. So we first of all have disabled this stroke, and this is actually a property that stems from the graphic node, which rectangle inherits from. So in graphic node we just have stroke enabled. It's a boolean, it defaults to true as I've said, and if it's false the stroke is not rendered. So rather self-explanatory, once again we set it to false because we don't want the default stroke to be rendered. Next up, we actually want to have this rectangle have a red fill color, and as you can see there is a convenient property called fill, and it can be a color, a linear gradient, a radial gradient, or an image fill or an angular gradient. So there are a couple of options. And actually once again we get some example code here that says we can just say .fill equals a new color, and we can specify in one way or another a color within it. And to get some more details about this, we will actually go to our color documentation, which I think was in this tab. And as you can see, within this new color constructor, we can specify the value, which can either be a string in CSS color format, so hex and so on, color name, something. So there are multiple ways to specify a color, suffice it to say. And what we want to do is we want to use the CSS color format as a hex format. Even though we could just specify red, we want to have a little bit more flexibility for later. So what we will actually do is we will just say rectangle fill equals a new color of FFOOO, which of course is all red, 0 green, 0 blue, so just a solid red color. Now, that of course is great that we now have this, and if I now save it and we go back to Adobe XD and we run this command, I mean, yes, probably in the background maybe something got created, but really we didn't get any results yet. We also don't have any results in the console anymore, of course, because as you can probably remember, we don't have this anymore. We have removed our console log, so nothing is happening right now. And the reason that nothing is happening is because to actually see our rectangle that we have now created, we have to insert it somewhere in our document. And what we can do to actually insert it is we have to add a line that actually adds a child to a node. And what we actually just do, for simplicity's sake, we take the first item within our selection, which, for example, could be an artboard. So like this, our first item within the selection would be the artboard. So this is just basically equal to an artboard, so to speak. And we add a child, and we add exactly this rectangle as its child. And with that, already we should be able to, if we now run this plugin within Adobe XD, insert a rectangle. So if I now click my command, still nothing is happening. That, of course, might feel a little bit strange, but actually what's happening, even though we currently don't get any error in here, is that we are trying to call some things that are not globally available within our namespace right here. So we are trying to call new rectangle, and we are trying to call new color, but actually within this JavaScript file, even though it might seem counterintuitive if you're not too familiar with JavaScript, we don't yet have access to these two classes to create new instances from them. And to actually get access to that, we have to import them from the scenegraph module. And to do that, all we need to do is go up here into this import that we already have of the selection from the scenegraph, and just add the color and the rectangle class to it. If we now save the file and go back inside Adobe XD and select the artboard, if I now click my command, you can see that an arguably aggressive looking red rectangle gets added. If I now click on this artboard again, click my command once again, another red rectangle gets added. And with that, you actually already manipulated the XD document however you like it. And I mean, while it's not much, you've already done something to a document within Adobe XD. Last but not least, we actually also want to not have it completely in the top left-hand corner, but instead have it at the coordinates 100, 100 within our artboard. And to do this, we just place the rectangle within its parent's coordinates, and we will take a look at the documentation for this. So if we now go back to our documentation, we can go to the documentation for a scene node in this case. And within scene node, you can now see place in parent coordinates. And what you actually have to pass onto this is a registration point and a parent point. And this actually is a topic that has to do with coordinate spaces, and coordinate spaces are a little bit complicated, but suffice it to say, it most of the time works like this, that you have the x coordinate going from 0 to basically the width of the object, and you have going from top to bottom the y coordinate of an object. And so basically what this is doing is, say we have this object right here. This is our rectangle, and this itself once again has this coordinate base where at this point we have 0, 0. Or let's do it with a semicolon just to make it a little bit clearer. And what we are basically doing then is we're saying take this object at a registration point within its own local coordinate system, which is this right here, at some point. And in our code, we have specified that this point is 0, 0. So just the top left-hand corner, this point right here, and move our layer in a way such that this registration point 0, 0 then gets moved to a point within the parent's local coordinate space. So in this case, we want to move it to a point 100, 100 within our parent's coordinate space. So in this case, this probably doesn't make too much sense, but instead we have this point 100, 100 within our parent coordinate space, and all our code does is it moves this registration point and with it the whole object such that it is on this 100, 100 coordinate space within the parent coordinates. And if we now save our code and rerun it inside Adobe XD, you will be able to see that, assuming everything went well, actually this rectangle now gets placed at the coordinate 100, 100. And with a little bit of imagination, you can now hopefully already see how we can use this to, in the end, create a checkerboard pattern. Of course, there are still some more steps required, but this is really a good first step, and you have now successfully adjusted your plugin to really manipulate the XD document itself, the scene graph. And I think this is a good point to end this section. It is also another checkpoint, so in case you weren't able to follow along, just feel free to copy the code from checkpoint 1, and we will be able to continue in the next section and further adjust our plugin so that we slowly but surely can move to actually creating our final plugin. Thank you so much so far, and I'll see you in the next video.